Welcome from whichever part of the world you are zooming us from. My name is Tahila Katz, and on behalf of Camera on Campus, we're so grateful you could join us today for this very important topic. For those who don't know what Camera on Campus is, it's a phenomenal organization which gives students on campus the opportunity to find their pro-Israel voice and be able to use their various actions of free speech to inspire others to be pro-Israel. And that's something that many of us very rightfully take for granted because free speech should be given to all. But the question is, what happens when free speech is denied? And that's what brings us here today. We're finding increasingly more on college campuses around the world that pro-Zionist students are being denied the opportunity to platform and use free speech, which is allowed to so many other cultures for their pro-Israel experiences. Students are increasingly having their voices revoked and feel that they aren't able to express themselves. And that's why we're here today. Who I have with me today are student panelists who have all experienced some form of anti-Israel prejudice where they have not had the opportunity to use free speech in whichever reason. We're going to hear from them and their experiences of what they went through. And afterwards, we have a special appearance from member of Knesset Cotler-Wunsh, who has been a prominent voice against both anti-Semitism and diaspora events, and she is going to come on shortly. But first, a little bit about our panelists who will be joining us today. First, we have Blake Flayton. Blake Flayton is a junior at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He is currently studying political communication. Blake has been active in democratic politics for nearly 5 years and is currently a writer on anti-Semitism within the progressive movements. He is a prominent voice about why it's a serious problem. He's an advocate for Jews and Israel on social media. He is one of Allgemeine's 2020 top 100 people who have positively influenced Jewish life. And he has bylines in the New York Times, Tablet Magazine, Haaretz, and The Forward. Welcome, Blake. Next, we have Daniel. Daniel Marcus is a literature student who is currently in his final year of study at the University of Nottingham. As a proud Zionist, former Israel officer at Nottingham University and Camera on Campus fellow, Daniel has been an active part of the on-campus fight for Israel and has organized many events, demonstrations, and award-winning Peace Week, and is a strong defender of Israel and free speech. And last, but certainly not least, we have Noah. Noah Lew is a first-year student at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. He was born and raised in Edmonton, Alberta, and has been involved in Jewish community leaders and organizations in various capacities since high school. During undergrad at McGill University, he became involved in student government and was forced out by a student for employing anti-Semitic tropes against him. Noah was then reinstated and is passionate about advocacy, and he is joining us today. So we are going to hear from all of them. And let's start with Blake. Blake, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tahila, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I'm really happy to be here and excited for this conversation. So as previously mentioned, I'm a student. I'm a junior at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And the reason why I chose to go to GW was because I knew even at the age of 16, 17, that I wanted to be involved in politics and in progressive activism, even in high school. It was something that I wanted to pursue in college, and it's something that I certainly did pursue in college. All throughout my freshman year, I was involved in protests nearly every single weekend. I worked for my congressman, and I was involved in advocacy all over campus and all over Washington, D.C., whether that be for reproductive justice, for criminal justice, for LGBTQ equality, for environmental justice, and so on and so forth. And it was such a huge part of my life and really the reason why I went to school in Washington, D.C. And I loved it. And the communities and the friends that I made were forever. But as time went on, and it sort of happened incrementally throughout my freshman year and then into my sophomore year, I realized that I was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the language and the rhetoric that was being used in these spaces to not only describe Israel, but to describe people who were in support of Israel, or not even people who were necessarily in support of Israel, but people who felt a connection to Israel or who were uncomfortable with Israel being demonized and vilified in the way that it was. Some examples of this were how in every single social justice conversation that was being had, there was always a way to kind of drag the Israeli-Palestinian conflict into these conversations when really they had nothing to do with Israel-Palestine. And I realized sooner rather than later that it was actually kind of an obsession, that there was this sort of manic insistence on bringing Israel up and using a platform to demonize people who were in support of Israel or who felt a connection to Israel at any possible juncture. And this made me increasingly uncomfortable, and I started losing friends because I started mustering up the courage to call it out and to confront it and to say, hey, you know, it's really not okay to be saying this type of things and to be marking people who are part of your movement as things like racist, baby killers, genocide apologists, et cetera, et cetera. And so really my sophomore year, what happened was there was a girl at my school who was caught on camera at a party saying, the person behind the camera asked her, what are we going to do to Israel? And she said, we're going to bomb Israel, you Jewish pieces of blank. And that caused sort of an uproar on campus. And it really attuned a lot of people to the issue of anti-Semitism on college campuses. But for me, it was just the icing on top of the cake. This had come after 2 years of experiencing this type of language. And so I decided to put all of my feelings and all of my frustrations with the spaces that I had been a part of on paper. And I published a New York Times piece, or excuse me, I wrote an op-ed about my experiences, and I was lucky enough to have the New York Times publish it in November of 2019. And after that, it was really just full steam ahead. I became a full-time advocate for Jews in progressive spaces, for Israel in progressive spaces, and also just combating the sentiments within this sort of culture that lead to anti-Semitism, because I believe they are a direct mirror image to what the Labor Party experienced under Jeremy Corbyn in the past couple of years. So as was previously said, I have bylines in Tablet Magazine, in Haaretz, and The Forward, and I consider myself a full-time advocate for Jews in progressive spaces, because I do believe that the Jewish people have a place in this movement. We have a place being activists for policy issues that we care about. But in order to continue to be in this movement, we have to be brave enough to call out anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias wherever we find it. So I'm very appreciative to be on this conversation, and I'm looking forward to hear what everyone has to say and what we discuss.
Thank you, Blake. That was amazing. And I read several of your pieces, and they're all very informative and really wonderful. So thank you. Next, Daniel. Daniel, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Cool. Hello. Thank you for the introduction before. As stated, I'm Daniel Marcus. I was formerly the Israel and Campaigns Officer at Nottingham JSOC with the Jewish and Israel Society, and a camera fellow there. My sort of approach to Zionism on campus was always trying to start a conversation and educate students and everyone on the university campus as to sort of the complexities of the issues. I always find that sound bites and distilled versions of the conversation always reduce the complexities of the situation and allow ideologues to sort of dominate the conversation about Israel, and it's always leads to this unfair representation. So my approach was always to foster a positive dialogue about the conversation, about the conflict, about Zionism, the conversation about what Zionism is, why Israel has the right to exist. I always felt that was the correct approach. But unfortunately, I was heavily no-platformed, or attempted. There was a consistent attempt to no-platform every conversation that I was trying to host when I was the campaigns officer. I believe that the no-platforming I faced sort of came in two forms. The first form was this committee stage no-platforming. Before the events even took place, there were attempts to cancel them from ever happening. So For example, I tried to collaborate with Palestinian Society for conversations. I tried to collaborate with the Left Society, who are our biggest opponents. They always outright refused to collaborate with us. But then also, surprisingly, there were other societies that should have been more keen to host these conversations that also flat out refused after a committee stage. Nottingham Labour students at the time when Labour was trying to sort of recover its image so strongly, they refused at a committee stage. The Islamic Society refused to collaborate with us. And the Politics Society, ironically, would not host an event talking about the Israeli election on the basis that they wanted to remain apolitical. And it would have been a two-sided discussion too. So there was that side of it. And then there was the more hostile, outright obstruction of events that were already going ahead. I was privileged enough to get into contact with Professor Alan Dershowitz, Harvard lawyer and strong Israel advocate, for an event discussing the case for Israel, which is a book that he wrote. And once we had sort of submitted the appropriate documentation to the university, there was an immediate call for the event to be cancelled. This was supposedly in line with the sort of the complexities of the scandal around his there was a sexual assault scandal and allegations that were made against him, but were never proven. And so all these claims were made that Nottingham students were made to be feel unsafe around the conversation of sexual assault if he was allowed to speak on our campus. Luckily, allegations that are unfounded or unproven weren't based at the university to cancel the event. The event was allowed to go ahead. I booked a room and the day came. The second attempt to cancel our event was to, before our event started, about an hour before, the capacity of the room was, they attempted to fill it by bringing hundreds of students into the room to try and, who opposed the conversation even happening, to fill up the capacity so that the event wouldn't be able to take place. But luckily, having a bit of chutzpah and it being a sort of a Jewish event, we just shoved everyone in the room anyway. We had people sitting on the floor, sitting on each other's laps. And there was actually quite quite electric atmosphere in the event at the time. And the event went ahead. Interestingly, I've always been a big fan of the discussion side of bringing speakers to campus. So I had an extended Q&A for the talk, which is about 40% of the event. And not one question, or they asked a lot of questions, not one question had anything to do with the sexual assault scandal. Every single question that was posed was, there is no right for Israel to exist. There is no case for Israel. One student even accused Alan Dershowitz himself of war crimes, which I thought was a little bit far, but nevertheless, it speaks to the dishonesty of those that use no platforming as a tool. It's not because they care about protecting anyone. They care about shutting down speech they disagree with. And so my conclusion from my experience as the campaigns officer and my approach that I'm taking into my continued further Zionist activism, which I've always kept and I think has only been strengthened by my experience as the Nottingham Israel campaigns officer, is to speak forthrightly, speak honestly, and never back down. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. That's really fantastic advice. And it's such an example of how you're facing the battle against free speech if you're not even given the opportunity to speak at all. So thank you for that. And last but not least, Noah, go for it.
Thank you so much. So I've likewise, to Blake and Daniel, I guess, always been interested in politics and in community leadership and in Jewish community involvement. But Israel was actually never a focal point for what I was interested in and what I wanted to be involved with. When I went to McGill University in Montreal for my undergraduate degree, I wanted to get involved in Jewish life and I wanted to get involved in student politics. And I remember in my first year, we had 2 BDS votes successively, and in my second year, a third. And so that was within a 2-year period. There were 3 repeated attempts to pass that, and the student body continually rejected it, but it was a dialogue that we continued to have. And partly as a result of that, and partly as a result of other things that I wanted to get involved with and change in our student government, I chose to get involved, and I applied for the board of directors of my student government. And when I submitted my application and my resume, I was advised by older Jewish students to remove all Jewish related material from my resume so that I would have a chance to potentially successfully gain the position. And naturally that was upsetting to me at the time, and it still is, obviously, but I knew that it was something that I had to do if I wanted to actually get involved and make a difference. So I did that, and I ultimately joined the board of directors and was very proud as a member of that board to ratify a decision that had been made by our judicial body of our student union a year prior that deemed BDS motions to be unconstitutional based on discrimination on the basis of national origin. And that
Noah,
was a decision. Yeah.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I'd love to go back to you in a few moments, just due to things being a little crazy at the Knesset. Member of Knesset Cotler-Wunsh, she needs to do her intro pretty quick before she goes. Can we go back to you in like 2 minutes?
No problem at all.
Fantastic, thank you. Generally, I would do the intro first, but if she has to go, then we'll do her first, and then we'll let her speak for it, and then we'll do her intro afterwards.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can. Thank you.
Perfect. I can't really even take off my mask. I'm just saying hello briefly and putting it back on because I am currently in the quarantine zone of the Israeli Knesset, about to deliver a speech that I came in to deliver, and my glasses are going to fog up. So first of all, I want to apologize to Noah for interrupting in the middle of what is a very important presentation of what I remember happening at McGill. I am originally from Montreal. I grew up in Montreal, served in Israel as a lone soldier. My LLB is from Hebrew University, but my LLM is from McGill University. And I remember the very beginning of what you are experiencing and describing, Daniel and Noah and Blake, and possibly many other students that are here with us tonight. And I'm going to just tell you that when they call me in to speak, I will run in and come back, even if I'm in the middle, okay? Okay. So they will call me in. So that's the story of my life at the moment. So excuse me. So what I wanted to tell you is, first of all, hearing each of your stories and reading your article, Blake, and hearing and knowing of how you utilized, Noah, the knowledge and understanding of the law in order to combat what you witnessed firsthand. And Daniel, your important story and the way that we really engage with this subject. And I think that we are very fortunate to have you on the front lines. And at the end of the day, you to have the courage to what I call exposing the imperative of exposing the double standards. And before entering Knesset, and actually I'm just about to complete my doctoral thesis on freedom of speech on university campuses, or I would say the lack thereof. And I'll share anecdotally that you know what you really see happening on university campuses, and you are way more familiar with it than many of my peers, academic, legal scholars that don't know yet in the state of Israel that there are such things as speech codes, microaggressions, trigger warnings, safe spaces, platforming. They don't know this terminology. One of the most important things to understand is this is a whole terminology that sort of enables the double standards that actually undermine the very principles that were initially set out to be protected, whether it's free speech, in the case of free speech on university campuses, and of all places, you would expect freedom of speech on university campuses. And actually, even the thought that there's such a thing as no free speech in the place where you are meant to inquire and think and actually be bothered by somebody else's perspective or point of view. And that's okay. But somehow we've arrived at this place where, while there are protected safe spaces for all other students, every year, as you all know, there is an Israel Apartheid Week on the very same campuses that have speech codes. So the irony of that and the importance and the imperative of discerning, of identifying, of combating the double standards and of engaging with others. And I would say we invented intersectionality. You know, I'm a little older than you guys, so I remember when the term intersectionality was coined. But we invented it way before. Jews marched with Martin Luther King. We fought for the freedom of Nelson Mandela and against apartheid. We shouldn't lose sight of that. And the importance of intersectionality is in identifying indeed what Kimberly Crenshaw may have intended, you know, transcending beyond or above what separates us to what joins us together, but not using it and abusing it in order to undermine the very values that we set out to protect. The opposite, identifying authentically how we implement consistent policies to everybody. Because if you can't protect one minority, one religion, one group of students, one country, then you can't protect any minority, any religion, any country. And I'll tell you a little bit. I'm in Knesset, and when I bring the understanding of these global processes, first of all, to the gap that still exists on Israeli university campuses, there isn't necessarily a familiarity with what you experienced, with what you know, and you have very important knowledge that you can actually share between you, but also with the state of Israel. And, you know, I headed the, am chair of the Israel Diaspora Relations Committee. One of the first sessions that I held is about anti-Semitism on university campuses. It's very important that we as Israeli legislators, decision makers, and beyond, of course, academicians and so on, be aware of and know what the challenges that you face are. Excuse me, I think I have to go speak. Beck, I have to go speak. Okay. I am going to go speak, and I'm going to propose that Noah finishes what he, you know, was about to tell you, and I will come back. Is that okay?
That's perfect.
And
Thank
I apologize. Thank you, Tehila.
Thank you so much. No, we're so sorry about that. Please continue.
No, that's no problem. It was a very interesting interlude, and I'm excited to hear more from her after. I think where I left off is I was just talking about getting involved with the board of directors of my student union, and part of that early involvement was ratifying a previous decision that had been made by our judicial board, and that decision had declared BDS motions to be unconstitutional on the basis that they were discriminatory based on national origin. And so that decision had actually been made the year prior, but had been left unratified by the previous board of directors, which was actually improper at the time. And so as a result of us having ratified that decision, there was a campaign that was launched led by the BDS movement and students who were involved with it. That campaign was called Democratize SMU, which was the name of our student union. And it used anti-Semitic tropes of Jews as corrupt and politically powerful, which they later actually admitted, to encourage students to show up to a procedural vote that re-ratified the board of directors to vote down Jewish and pro-Israel students. And so in a move that was later found to be unconstitutional, the names were separated on that vote, and my name was chosen, and I was voted down as a result. And when I was voted down, the only actual concern verbally cited was issues with my name. And so this was obviously a very upsetting circumstance. It was upsetting for me, and it was upsetting for other members of the Jewish and pro-Israel community on campus. And in the aftermath, there was actually a lot of backlash that came from other students, Jewish and non-Jewish. There was a lot of support that I received from all over the country and around the world, actually. And so there was, in some senses, some good that came out of this. And, you know, I spoke out about what had happened. I spoke out through a number of forums, and it was covered quite extensively in Canadian media and some Israeli media as well. And as a result of that, a bunch of non-Jewish students actually led a petition for me to be reinstated to my position. The McGill School Administration was also quite supportive at this time. I met with them repeatedly. And to just fast forward a few months after that, there were some positive things that came out of speaking out about this injustice. And now actually there is anti-Semitism training that's mandated for executives on the student government now. And that's actually run by the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, which is led by member of the Knesset, Michal Cotler-Wunsh's father, Erwin Kotler, who does really a remarkable job. And in addition to that, I had the opportunity to speak in many forums about what had happened and try to put a positive spin on the ways that we can prevent this happening to other students in the future. So the lessons, I guess, that I learned from this experience were to be proud of who you are, to speak up against injustices facing you, your community, and other communities as well, and the importance of dialogue and of speaking out and speaking up. And so I'm looking forward to hearing from everyone's questions. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing with us both times, and thank you for so patiently putting up with the interruption. Next, we have a question for each of you before we go on to a main question and answer session, which will be at the end. The audience pre-submitted questions for you, and I'm going to ask each of you one question now that the audience has submitted. And I think just to make it easier, we're going to go in the order that you spoke. So the first one is for Blake. Okay. Blake, you've written and spoken out a lot against the BDS movement and BDS resolutions on campus. And one of the things that you've claimed is that the resolutions have very little to do with the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. Can you shed some light on that?
Of course. So the reason why I say that BDS movements and BDS resolutions on campus have actually very little to do with Israel-Palestine is because if you've ever sat in on a BDS resolution debate or a proposition or a vote, you'll know that very little discussion of what's actually happening in Israel-Palestine is heard. There's very little discussion of policy, of actual things that are happening on the ground in relations to this conflict. What happens instead is employment of Natan Sharansky's 3 Ds of Anti-Semitism as it relates to Israel discourse. And those are demonization, delegitimization, and double standards. And those 3 things that are inflicted against Israel during the BDS culture, in the BDS culture, I should say, are also things that are targeted towards Jewish students and toward pro-Israel students. And so the way that operates is you have demonization, where, as I said, instead of specific policies, instead of specific things that Israel does wrong, Israel's called a genocide state, a terrorist state, an apartheid state. Israel is conflated with white supremacy. Zionism is conflated with racism, or even Nazi Germany, Nazism. And so what then happens is anybody who objects to that, anybody who puts themselves forward and says that's anti-Semitic or that's offensive or that's insensitive, then ergo gets branded with all of those words that were used against Israel. So if a Jewish student who might not even be that supportive of Israel or have that strong of connection to Israel says something like, you can't equate the IDF to Nazis, they will then be branded with every accusation that was leveled against Israel. So that's that kind of unilateral demonization that is levied against us when we speak out. And the second part is delegitimization, where constantly during BDS resolutions, you will hear that Israel is a colonial enterprise, that it is occupying mandatory Palestine, that it does not have a right to exist, that it does not exist. Some people are quite, think they're funny and refuse to say the word Israel because they don't recognize it as a country. And then what happens is anybody who comes out and says, well, I'm a Zionist, I have family in Israel, or I might be alive today because Israel saved my family and provided a place of refuge for my family after the Shoah or after the Farhud or any time throughout Jewish history, they are then delegitimized. Their opinion is not warranted. Their identity is not welcome into these spaces. They're framed as just having a political opinion, not an actual attachment to a piece of land or culture that's on that piece of land. They are accused of being Hasbara agents. They're accused of shilling for Israel, or et cetera, all of the delegitimization tactics that I'm sure everyone here is aware of. And then the third is double standards. The third element is double standards. As we've seen, there is no equivalent on campus to this amount of outcry against Israel in relation to another country. There are plenty of countries around the world who are committing atrocities against their own people, who are engaging in terrible misdeeds, whether they be politically, socially, economically, whatever. And you do not see this type of activism at all. And in fact, it is considered racist and xenophobic, as it well should, to hold students who have some sort of connection to a country that is committing these misdeeds accountable or demonizing them on behalf of that country. And so that's an innate double standard in regards to Israel and in regards to Jewish students who support Israel or who consider themselves Zionists. And then, of course, the double standard transcends what just happens in the BDS debate hall. But when Jewish students raise their voices or complain or take it up with administration or faculty or even their own peers on the student government, what happens is we are not heard. All accusations on campus, as they well should, are accepted with legitimacy, whether they be racism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, you name it. We are all very attuned to those things and very receptive to people who claim that they experience them. And especially in progressive spaces, we want to do all the work we can to validate them and to acknowledge them and to find out what went wrong. But that same sentiment, that same sensitivity is not afforded to Jewish students. And the reason why is because anti-Semitism is being framed as a political mechanism that Jewish students use to silence criticism of Israel, which is just absurd because, as I said before, there is no criticism of Israel happening. There is demonization and vilification of Israel happening, and by extension, demonization and vilification of pro-Israel students and Jewish students for that matter. And so these three things coupled together all illustrate the culture of BDS on campus. Very, very little to do with what Israel's actually doing, what Palestine's actually doing, or what a boycott campaign would actually do to Israel. And again, all of these resolutions are non-binding. Very, very rarely does actual action happen with the campus to actually divest from Israel. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, what is the point of all of this then? And I think that goes to show some broader narrative about anti-Israel activism on campus. It's not so much to better the lives of Palestinians or to install a system of justice or more of justice in the Middle East, but rather it's a performance, if you will, in order to marginalize Jewish students and to make sure that that they know their place on campus.
Right. Thank you so much, Blake. Thank you for sharing with us the 3Ds. I really think it's very applicable, and we've seen repeatedly the hypocrisy of the BDS movement, especially in regards to giving platforms both to speak and, like you said, who they invite to the conversation. So thank you for that. Our next question is for Daniel. Daniel, you shared with us your experience of not being able to speak and organize an event and have a platform. So our question's about that. So clearly no platforming is a problem which you faced and which was terrifying. But our question is, for students who are denied that platform like you were, how are they able to be Israel advocates? What tools can they use?
Right, it's a very good question. I think there's two forms of no platforming. There's sort of structural no platforming, where your attempts to speak are shut down before they even occur, and it's very, very disheartening when that happens, and it can be really difficult to resist. And then there's no platforming, where sort of you're misrepresented as a person, and so that students who would otherwise want to voluntarily listen to you, or perhaps wouldn't initially have a qualm with voluntarily listening to you, would actually have this sort of preconception about who you are, what your views are. Like Blake was saying with this demonization, I personally experienced that. There was sort of informal online dossiers made about me personally that had all like lies and disinformation about what my beliefs supposedly were, in order to convince students to never attend my events in the first place. And I was actually, I wouldn't say lucky, but I was privileged enough to see a leaked version of one of those dossiers to me, and it was quite aggressive. There were manufactured stories about actions I'd supposedly taken in my old secondary school there that weren't true. There was name calling, and I realized that this was sort of an attempt to implant the idea that anyone who represents Israel positively on campus must already have some ulterior negative motive to do so. Like, you couldn't sincerely, as an honest, good person, support the state of Israel. You have to actually be a secret white supremacist, a secret racist, a secretly battering for the return of imperial rule of the British Empire. The only way to really combat that is to speak as much as possible, because I am my best defender on campus when I'm speaking outwardly defending Israel, stating my opinions. It's obvious that I'm not secretly any of the accusations that were made against me, which means it's not to retreat, and it's not to create tactics that would sort of play them at their own game. It's not fighting fire with fire. It's just to speak consistently, honestly, defend Israel with the same points and the same arguments that are the true points, the true arguments, and you'll find that people will actually realize that there is a complete disparity between what's being said about what you're saying and what you're actually saying. For the example I gave about the Alan Dershowitz talk, it was clear that he was making a rational case, not a racist case for Israel. And afterwards, there were a few students that came up after the event, and they spoke to us, and they sort of remarked on this disparity. And these were students that had previously didn't have an appreciation or understanding of what the situation was, despite it, except for what they'd heard from other students and their professors. And it's by speaking honestly. I think I'm sort of harking on the same message, but I think it's so important that we can start to bridge that misinformation. You can bridge that misinformation and no platforming. And if your platform has physically been taken away from you, is try again, do another one. If your a formal event's been cancelled, do an informal event. It doesn't necessarily have to be affiliated with the university to be an on-campus event. Continuously speak, continuously shout, get your voice out, be heard. That's the only way to fight it. If you stand for truth, then people will notice.
Thank you. That's really inspiring, and you definitely are a phenomenal example of that. So our question for Noah is, you mentioned at the beginning that you weren't always interested in pro-Zionist movements, and that wasn't what you were so involved with at the beginning. So if you would turn that question back to someone who might have been the way you were at the beginning of school, which would have been not hostile, but just uninterested, what would you be able to gain? What would students on campus gain if people were able to be proud of Zionism on campus and would be able to have open and honest dialogue? What benefits would that have for campus in general if you would be going back and convincing someone like yourself of why it makes sense to try and make that happen?
Thank you so much for that question. I think that one of the biggest lessons I derive from my experiences at McGill is the power of interpersonal relationships. And there's a real distinction that I think can be made between talking with people and talking at people. And when you're speaking with people, there's more of a relationship, and there's more of an ability to understand and explain and relate and listen. And so, for example, in my personal experience, when I was voted down off of the board of directors, at the time I was also involved with the student government at a faculty level, and a lot of my colleagues, other students on that board, were anti-Israel students. We didn't see eye to eye at all on the issues, but I'd gotten to know them through working with them, and we gained, a bit of a rapport and a friendship, and they understood where I was coming from, and they respected me as an individual. And so when the time came and the vote happened and I was voted down in that way, They may have disagreed with my politics and disagreed with how I felt about Israel, certainly, but they actually all messaged me and rallied around me in support because they knew me as an individual. They knew that I wasn't, a fascist pig that people might have wanted to make me out to be. And they knew that wasn't the reality just from having had conversations with me. And often those conversations weren't about Israel. They had nothing to do with Israel, but they just got to know me on a human level and my values and my morals, and they understood that that wasn't the way that I was being portrayed. And so I think that that taught me the importance of dialogue on such a human level, and especially now, when people get so caught up in their social media echo chambers and are unable, they shut out perspectives that don't align with theirs, and they often refuse to engage with those, and often don't have the opportunity to. It's so important to develop those interpersonal relationships and speak to people on a human level. And so I think that's what I would say to someone who is in their first year coming into undergrad. I would talk to them about the importance of having dialogue and having peaceful dialogue, and how that builds community and tolerance. And a part of that is being able to speak proudly and openly about who you are and what you believe in. Granted that it's obviously not hateful in nature, but you should be proud to be. You should be able to speak openly and proudly about being Jewish and about being Zionist and pro-Israel. And on my campus, Zionism was a dirty word. Like, for me to say I was a Zionist was akin to me saying I was a racist and a imperialist, and that shut down the types of dialogue that I'm proposing that help lead to a more peaceful and understanding and tolerant campus culture and environment. And so those are the ways that we can work to help build a better environment and build a better world and build a better campus setting. And it's through those mechanisms of dialogue and respect.
Thank you so much, Noah. So now what we're going to do is we're going to invite the audience to write questions. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, it says questions and answers. To write questions, you can specify who you want the questions to be posed for. I see we already have a couple. And then while Michal speaks, we are going to be addressing our questions to our panelists. So I see we have a couple, so let's begin. So our first question is for Blake. We're keeping the order because it just makes sense. Blake, it seems that Israel is falling increasingly out of favor with the progressive movement. Do you find that that's true? And if so, how can we solve that issue?
So yes, is the short answer, but I will give a long answer. Israel has been falling out of favor with the progressive movement for the very reason that the progressive movement wants to fall out of a relationship with Israel. There is a growing tide happening not only on college campuses, but also in our institutions, whether they be journalism, whether they be mass media, whether they be the halls of Congress, whether they be foreign policy decision tables, whether they be the United Nations, that is holding Israel to be something that does not fall on the good side of the ledger of justice. And there's a lot of explanations that can go into that framing, and we can, of course, discuss them. But what it comes down to is the framing of Israel as powerful, as white, as Western, as imperialist, as colonialist. And if you frame Israel in that light, if you frame Israel using that rhetoric and that terminology, you can say anything you want against it, no matter how offensive, no matter how over the line, no matter how out of left field, and it will be portrayed as social justice because it's viewed as speaking truth to power. It's viewed as punching up, right? If you say something shocking and very over the line about Israel, it really doesn't make a difference because, well, you're just sticking it to the man, right? Because that's the way that Israel and all manifestations of Zionism have been portrayed. And so we're in a culture right now where progressives and people on the left really like those who are portrayed as victims, and really like those who are portrayed as underdogs and not the people in power. And that leaves the Jews in Israel in a very tricky situation. And how do we stop this? I think there are ways to stop it. I think this panel is one of them. We just need to be educating people about our story, that the Jewish people existed long before 1948. We have a lot of history, a lot of trauma, and a lot of I guess events throughout our time on Earth that contribute to where we are now as a people. And that story is multifaceted and nuanced and touching and inspiring and frustrating and everywhere in between. And if we can humanize that experience, we will by extension humanize Israel. And that is the most effective way to approach this conflict, because Israel, because of its positioning as not in the good guy camp by people on the left, that's the way to get out of this, is to just share our story, educate people on how anti-Semitism works, how it manifests, what Zionism really is, not what somebody on Twitter said Zionism was, or somebody in Instagram infographic said Zionism was. Jewish students and Jewish people across the country, especially if they want to remain involved in the left, need to have the courage to tell this narrative, to share this narrative, because it's constantly being taken away from us.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so our next question is for Noah from Eliana Wagner. She says, I have a question. How do we think that we can separate the narrative of Zionism being equated with white supremacy?
So I think actually just harkening back to some of what Blake was talking about, it's really important, like Blake was saying, he's involved with a lot of other progressive causes, and that often these spaces are becoming increasingly difficult to be part of as a pro-Israel Jewish student in person. But I still think that's a really valuable and important effort. When we show up for other people, there's a greater likelihood that they'll show up for us as well. And it's important that as Jews, we show that we, as Jews and as pro-Israel people and students, we demonstrate that our values are aligned with things other than white supremacy and racism, like they're suggesting, and that our values instead are aligning with a lot of the causes that the people who are actually often attacking us themselves feel that they align with. And so I think, it's a mixture of factors and things that we can do to help rectify this situation. Some of it is historical, and some of it is providing the historical and factual information that is often mischaracterized and falsely stated in media and in campus settings and personal settings. And then of course, part of it is just having dialogue with people, partnering with other organizations and other issues, and demonstrating the shared values that we have that are not those that we are often branded as having.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense, and that really answers the point. And now we are so honored to have Member of Knesset Michal Cotler-Wunsh address us. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Please forgive my crazy, it's just my life. So we'll resume from where we were. I'm sorry I missed the rest of your statements, and I'm going to catch up from Becca to hear what you discussed. I hope I don't repeat things that you already mentioned, and I would have loved to hear from you. And if there are things that you believe that I should hear, please be in touch with us to follow up, and Becca will keep me abreast of what was said. I think we were at intersectionality that we invented and that we have to take back. I think that it's extremely important. I think that as you engage on campuses and beyond campuses, and we have to understand I'd say the process of what has happened with freedom of speech on university campuses, specifically with regard to what you have experienced, is actually seeped off campus. It has not remained on campus. If you think of what cancel culture means, if you think of its formations, it was a testing ground, including the entire BDS, that Noah described, the entire bringing of those decisions through the student unions, the SSMU at McGill, and so forth. These are very important insights that you have experienced firsthand. They actually inform many of the challenges and other issues that transcend challenges that we have as Jews, that we have as the state of Israel, that we have as Zionists, whether we identify as such or not. It's not the point. And, I recently had a very interesting conversation with Richie Torres. He was just elected. And I really, first of all, commend his ability to understand the challenges that we face in this way, but I also encourage us to look to those examples to understand that this transcends what we might believe has to do just with us, and that we have to create those conversations, those engagements. Actually, when I asked Richie Torres how he came to these realizations, he said, I was saved from university, so I never had to go through the entire cycle of learning and unlearning, which was very sad for me to hear. He never attended university and believes and attributes the fact that his mind wasn't spoiled and his ability to, sort of think for himself wasn't spoiled by university. That's a terrible sort of reality that we have to contend with and universities have to contend with. I want to mention a couple of things, and I'm sure that you've mentioned IRA and the important tool that IRA is, because many people ask, so is it not legitimate to criticize Israel? And of course it's legitimate to criticize Israel. I invite you into the Knesset. It's what we do here every day. 120 people criticize Israel every single day. And we know that that is not the issue. The criticism of the state of Israel, like any other state, is legitimate. The question is it legitimate to question its very legitimacy to exist? And that is a fundamental difference that we should not be sort of shy away from and be afraid to engage in. There's only one country in the world that I know that there are calls for its genocide, the state of Israel. There's only one country in the world that's very legitimacy to exist as what it was created to be 72 years ago, founded upon the vision, mission, values of the Declaration of Independence, Jewish and democratic, the Jewish homeland of an ancestral, the Jewish ancestral homeland of an indigenous peoples returning after thousands of years of exile, alongside the imperative to ensure, to protect, to uphold, to maintain the rights of all of its minorities, no matter who they are. All of that is in the Declaration of Independence. It is the identity of the state of Israel. And here's the good news. The good news is we're really living at a historic time. The Abraham Accords enable us to understand the basic fundamental, and we shouldn't miss the forest for the trees, to understand the fundamental paradigm shift that has led away from what we know as rejectionism to normalization. And that paradigm shift involves a pivot away from what I call, the three no's, not I call, the 1967 Khartoum Conference defined the three no's: no to recognition of Israel, no to negotiation with Israel, no to peace with Israel, to the three yeses: yes to recognition of Israel, yes to negotiation with Israel, yes to peace with Israel. And the order is very important. And we should dwell on recognition, because recognition of the other's very right to exist, in this case, the right of the state of Israel to exist as Jewish and democratic, is fundamental to this shift. And I just had the complete honor to welcome a first group of, delegation of Bahraini and UAE journalists and influencers that came to Knesset. And I toured them around Knesset, and it was like we were living a moment in history which was so raw. And at the end of my words to them about recognition, one of them spoke up and said, after this trip, we don't just recognize Israel, we love Israel. Recognition. And I say that in the context of the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, because as you well know, the IRA definition in its entirety that's been adopted by over 30 countries, and very importantly, is a tool that I think just recently was adopted by the Premier League in the UK, that can be used by, sports associations, by the police force in France, It includes what we know of as the 3 Ds, the demonization, the delegitimization, and the double standards against the state of Israel. It gives us an incredible tool to also hold to account an engagement that I've recently had after holding hearings within the Knesset about anti-Semitism online. Because in order to address a problem, you first have to define it. And lucky for us, in the case of anti-Semitism, there is an agreed upon, internationally agreed upon definition, the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. And we are holding to task the digital platforms to A, define the problem, B, create transparent policy, which C is then implemented transparently towards all, consistently, without double standards. Now, when I say we, I have to tell you that after 3 hearings in the Knesset with TikTok and Facebook and Twitter and Google, actually, I co-founded an international bipartisan task force to combat online anti-Semitism with parliamentarians from the UK and Canada and the US and Australia and Israel, of course. And it's really important that we understand that this is a global issue, that we need to address it globally, that online and offline is sort of, we would be remiss if we really thought that what's happened on campus stayed on campus. We know it seeped off of campus, and we know that it's now online, and there is really no difference. So when we combat online anti-Semitism, it's because we have to hold the digital platforms to account. It's because with that tremendous power that they have tremendous responsibility, and we the users, we the legislators, we governments have ourselves to hold them to account and understand what it is that we need to hold them to account for. Is it the business model? Is it the fact that they don't have policy? Is it the fact that it isn't implemented consistently? That is something that we are delving deeper into. But what's important about the understanding that A, this is a global issue, B, that we have to collaborate and address it globally, and C, and this is important for everything that you guys do, this is really not singularly about anti-Semitism. It's about all forms of hate. It is the proverbial canary in the mine shaft that we are talking about. And so it makes our role that much more important, your responsibility that much greater, and that much more significant of an impact you can make. Because when you are able to create the knowledge, and I would say always base what you say on facts, whether it's Noah and using the law, whether it's Blake and using the facts, whatever it is that you need to do in order to equip yourselves with the tools to create the best argument you can in order to engage and not be fearful of engagement. Because at the end of the day, and I say this consistently in all of the matters that I'm involved in terms of Israel standing in the international arena, be it the ICC, be it the case and cause of 2 deceased soldiers, 2 Israeli civilians that have been held by a genocidal terror organization, Hamas, for over 6.5 years in Gaza, in standing violation of international law, and nothing has been done by the international community. These are, or as we speak, actually, 17 resolutions have passed in the UN against the state of Israel. 17 resolutions, 7 against the rest of the world. What's wrong with that picture is not us. It's not that it's about Israel. It's not that it's about Jews. It's that those trustees of international law and human rights are actually not fulfilling their mandate. The ICC, other institutions of international law, the very foundations of international law, principles such as reciprocity and complementarity, when they are ignored, when they are overlooked, the entire system that they are the foundations of is undermined, and therefore it cannot protect anybody. Therefore, it enables a continued culture of impunity. When we think of regimes of terror, whether it's in Iran or in Gaza or in Syria or elsewhere, or Venezuela or China, with the Uyghurs in China, what empowers a continued culture of impunity is the enablement of double standards. And so use this as a case study, use this to collect the tools, use this to collect the insights, and you are a tremendous resource. And finally, a tremendous source of hope. A tremendous source of hope, because when I hear your stories and when I see your faces and when I know that you're committed in this way to this battle, not for yourselves and not just for the Jewish people, but really for the sake of humankind, then I am inspired and I am hopeful and I'm grateful that you are, the next generation that I'm sure will do a better job than we have. And I am always there for, information, and I'm accessible to you. Please bring up issues, whether they can be heard in Knesset, whether I can help on a professional or academic level. It's very, very important that we keep abreast of what is actually happening and engage with what's happening and what you confront now on campus, A, so that we know about it, and B, so that we can offer whatever it is that we can, whether it's guidance, whether it's just bringing together, you know, the discussions that are taking place so you can inform one another. And that's it. Thank you for the opportunity to engage with you guys. They may call me back in, but if there are a question or two, I may have time.
Unfortunately, we've reached the end of our session, but we're so grateful you could join us. And truly, Knesset Member Cotler-Wunsh, you are the paradigm of an example of someone who has taken the fight against anti-Semitism and the battle for free speech to the front line. And we've all greatly benefited from your policy, so thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight, both our student panelists who had such inspiring stories and narratives to share, which I know I greatly benefited from, Camera on Campus and our co-sponsors, and all our attendees. We really hope you learned and enjoyed, and we're looking forward to seeing you at more events. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a good night or afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Stay healthy.